The space station drifted silently in the void of space, its lights flickering softly against the backdrop of distant stars. It was a quiet place, a small human outpost nestled within a sector of the galaxy far from Earth. Most of the people stationed here were scientists, engineers, and technicians, just trying to make a living on the fringes of space. Among them was Elliot Kane, a young engineer with a quiet demeanor and a sharp mind. He wasn't the type of person who attracted attention, content to keep to himself, and focus on the work at hand. But today, everything was about to change. The day had started like any other. Elliot had spent his morning in the station's control room, making small adjustments to the power systems, checking readings, and ensuring everything was operating smoothly. The peace of routine was comforting. It gave him something to focus on, something that made the isolation of space feel a little less lonely. But as the clock ticked forward, something felt off, a quiet unease settling in the pit of his stomach. Then came the alert. It was a standard warning at first, just a blip on the radar. Ships moving too close to the station's territory, unregistered vessels passing through the sector. Nothing to be concerned about, until the proximity alarms went off. Elliot froze. It wasn't just a few ships. The alert confirmed dozens of unidentified vessels were entering the sector, and they were headed straight for the station. Red alert. All personnel to their assigned posts. Repeat, red alert. The voice of Commander Davies echoed through the station's intercom. Elliot's heart raced as the panic spread. He could hear the footsteps of his fellow crew members rushing down the hallways, the sound of doors opening and closing in haste. Everyone was scrambling to prepare for the worst. But what was the worst? No one had expected this. They were isolated here, far from any kind of military support. The station was meant for research and medical missions, not war. Elliot's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The ships on the radar were far too advanced to be human. The enemy had come from somewhere else, and judging by the speed at which they approached, they were ready for a fight. They didn't just want to capture the station, they wanted to destroy it. And the station, despite its advanced technology, wasn't built for defense. It was meant to heal, to study the stars, not to wage war. The call to action came fast, and Elliot found himself in the station's control room, his hands shaking as he worked to bring up the schematics of the station's defenses. There were only a few rudimentary weapons, mostly turrets designed to deter small pirate ships, but they were barely operational. He knew it wouldn't be enough. They needed more, and fast. "Elliot, can you get those shields online?" Commander Davies asked, his voice calm but tense. The man was a veteran, used to this kind of chaos, but Elliot could hear the strain in his words. "The shields can buy us a little more time." Elliot nodded quickly, his mind already calculating the best way to reroute power. He didn't have much experience with the station's defense systems, but he knew enough to get by. It wasn't a perfect solution, but if he could bring the shields online, it would delay the inevitable. He ran through the controls, his fingers flying over the console as he activated the emergency systems. The low hum of the shields activating echoed throughout the station, a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. But it wasn't enough. The enemy ships were already in range. A wave of shockwaves rocked the station as enemy fire pounded against the shields. They held, but just barely. Every hit sent a jolt of energy through the station's frame, causing alarms to blare in every hallway. The station was shaking, its fragile structure groaning under the strain. "Shields at 40%. We're not going to hold much longer," the technician shouted, panic rising in his voice. Elliot's mind was racing, calculating their options. They had to do something, or they would all die here. He glanced around, desperately looking for any way to turn the tide. And then it hit him. An idea so risky, so reckless, that it might just work. There was a power source deep in the station's lower levels, an old system that had been abandoned years ago when the station was first built. It was meant for a much larger project that had never come to fruition. But if he could tap into it, reroute its energy, He might be able to boost the station's defensive capabilities temporarily. It was their only shot. "Commander," Elliot shouted, not taking his eyes off the console. "I think I can reroute power from the old systems. It might give us enough juice to get the weapons systems up and running. But I need access to the lower levels." The commander didn't hesitate. "Go. We'll hold them off here as best we can." Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed to the elevator, the metal doors closing behind him with a quiet hiss. His mind was racing with calculations and possibilities. This was insane, but it was their only chance. He arrived in the lower levels, where the dim lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the silence here was unnerving. He had always been told the old systems weren't functional anymore, that they were too outdated to be of any use. But Elliot didn't have the luxury of second-guessing. He found the main access panel and pried it open, his hands working quickly to connect the power circuits. With a deep breath, he initiated the rerouting sequence, watching as the systems came online one by one. The hum of power surged through the station, and for the briefest moment, he thought he might have miscalculated. But then, a low rumble shook the station, and a bright light flared on the console. The weapons systems were online. "Systems ready," Elliot muttered under his breath, his eyes wide with disbelief. He quickly radioed back to the command center. "Weapons systems are online. I'm coming back up." But before he could leave, a loud explosion echoed through the lower levels. The station shook violently, sending Elliot crashing into the wall. He groaned, disoriented, his ears ringing. It wasn't over. The enemy had breached their defenses. He had to hurry. If he didn't get back to the control room, the station would be lost. Elliot forced himself to his feet, pain shooting through his body. But adrenaline kept him moving. He ran back to the elevator, his mind focused only on getting back to the fight. They weren't out of the woods yet. By the time Elliot made it back to the control room, the station was a war zone. Sparks flew from broken consoles, and smoke billowed from the walls. The alien fleet was relentless, pounding the station with everything they had. But Elliot's arrival gave the crew a glimmer of hope. The weapons were ready. Now they could fight back. "Elliot, you've done it," Commander Davies said, a rare smile crossing his face. "Now let's show them what humans can do." The control room erupted into action as Elliot worked to power up the weapon systems. The station's turrets began firing back, the sound of gunfire reverberating through the station. It wasn't enough to turn the tide, but it was a start. And in that moment, Elliot knew one thing: they weren't going down without a fight. The galaxy would soon learn that humanity was not to be underestimated. The spark of war had been ignited, and there was no turning back. The station shuddered under the relentless assault. The enemy ships hovered outside, a dark, menacing cloud of death just beyond the shields. Elliot stood in the command center, his hands shaking from adrenaline and the weight of the situation. The weapons systems were working, but they were still outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. Yet in this moment, Elliot knew that the real battle wasn't just against the alien forces. It was about proving humanity's place in the galaxy. "Sir, the enemy is regrouping," the technician at the control panel reported, his face pale, fingers trembling as he worked the consoles. "They're preparing for another attack. Their firepower is overwhelming. We can't hold out much longer." Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. The countdown was already ticking in his head. Each passing second was another step closer to annihilation. The human forces on this station, just a small team of engineers, scientists, and medics, were holding their ground, but the enemy was growing more confident with every passing minute. "We need more time," Elliot muttered, mostly to himself. But then the thought hit him. He could buy them time. He could do more. He rushed to the central console, his fingers flying across the keys. A few years ago, when he had first arrived at this station, he had worked on the deep-level systems that powered the station's energy grid. One of those systems was a hidden resource, a failsafe built into the station for emergencies, something the engineers thought they'd never need. It was an old and highly unstable energy reserve, something only a few people knew about. And if used correctly, it could create a burst of power so intense that it could disrupt the enemy's weapon systems temporarily, giving them the opening they needed to launch a counterattack. But it was a gamble. If it didn't work, or if the alien forces intercepted it, Elliot was certain the station would be reduced to rubble. Yet it was the only option they had left. He activated the failsafe, the energy core's ancient hum filling the room with a low, almost ominous vibration. Elliot could feel the tension in the air as the power began to surge through the station's core. The lights flickered for a brief moment, then returned with an unsettling brightness, as if the very heart of the station was coming to life. "Elliot, are you sure this is a good idea?" Commander Davies' voice cut through the tension, his face lined with worry. He knew what Elliot was attempting, and the risks it involved. If that energy core goes critical, we'll all be dead before we can even react. "I know, Commander, but we don't have any other choice," Elliot said, not looking away from the console. "This will buy us time. I'm reconfiguring the grid to send a concentrated burst of energy directly into the enemy fleet's weapon systems. It's our only shot." The countdown for the alien fleet's next attack continued to tick down, and Elliot felt the pressure mounting. He could hear the distant rumble of explosions outside, the battle intensifying. The alien ships were closing in, their weapon systems locking on. There was no more time to waste. The energy burst was ready. All Elliot had to do was activate it, but just as his fingers hovered over the button, a loud crackling sound filled the air. He turned to find one of the technicians frantically working on another console. The technician's voice quivered as he spoke. "Commander, we have a problem. The alien fleet is..." "Wait, what is this?" "The frequency. They're tapping into our comms." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The aliens had somehow found a way to hack into the station's communication systems. They knew everything: the location of the core, the reconfiguration process, and the energy burst. Elliot's heart sank as he realized what this meant. They were no longer just fighting an invasion. They were fighting an enemy that knew their every move. "Elliot, we need to disable the transmission." Commander Davies shouted. "We can't let them use our own systems against us." But it was too late. The alien ships began to fire again. And this time, the shots weren't just directed at the station's shields. They targeted the core. Elliot watched, helpless, as massive beams of energy slammed into the station, shaking it violently. The emergency lights flashed on, bathing the control room in a red, eerie glow. For a brief moment, everything went quiet. Then, the loudest explosion Elliot had ever heard rocked the station, sending him sprawling to the ground. The console in front of him exploded in a shower of sparks. His ears rang, and the lights flickered wildly, casting strange shadows across the room. The core was damaged. The station's energy systems were in critical failure. "Elliot," Davies yelled, his voice cracking through the chaos. "We need to stabilize the core. If that thing blows, we're all dead." Elliot forced himself to his feet, heart pounding, his body aching from the force of the explosion. "We're not done yet," he muttered to himself, his mind already calculating his next move. The core was unstable, but it wasn't beyond repair. There was still a chance. Rushing to the lower levels of the station once again, Elliot's mind raced. He had to act fast. The station's power grid was dangerously close to overheating, and if he didn't reset the core's energy flow, the entire station would go critical within minutes. He reached the control panel where the core was housed, the walls shaking with each blast from the enemy outside. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he manually rewired the systems, his hands steady despite the chaos surrounding him. Just as he finished the final adjustment, a loud crash echoed through the station. He turned to find the entrance to the chamber sealed shut, a thick layer of metal blocking his way. Panic threatened to set in, but Elliot fought it down. He had no time to be afraid. He activated the backup systems, forcing the access doors open with sheer force. The air was thick with smoke, and the faint sound of distant screams reached his ears. His mind pushed the noise away. He had a job to do. Reaching the core's main control, Elliot initiated a manual override. Sparks flew as the system groaned and whined, but then, slowly, the warning lights on the core began to turn from red to yellow, and then to green. A low hum filled the room. The core was stabilizing. It wasn't a victory yet. The station was still under heavy attack, and the aliens were relentless. But Elliot had bought them time, and that was all that mattered. He could hear the distant thrum of the weapon systems reactivating, ready to give the station one more chance to fight back. Elliot rushed back to the control room, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle wasn't over, but the spark of hope he had ignited was beginning to grow. It wasn't just about saving the station anymore. It was about something much bigger, the fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. The galaxy would know one thing: humans were not to be underestimated. As Elliot took his place at the console once again, his eyes locked onto the view screen. The alien ships were still there, circling like vultures, but they weren't invincible. Humanity had just shown the galaxy that it would fight back. And in that moment, Elliot knew that this was only the beginning. The war for the future had just begun. The station was still reeling from the attack. Despite the damage, despite the overwhelming odds, the human spirit remained unbroken. Elliot stood in the command center, his hands trembling slightly as he worked, still trying to process what had just happened. The energy core had stabilized, and the weapons systems were back online. For the first time since the attack had begun, he felt a flicker of hope, but it was fleeting. The enemy was relentless, and they were not going to back down just because they had taken a few hits. "Elliot, we've got a situation." Commander Davies' voice crackled over the comms. Elliot's heart raced. The enemy fleet is regrouping. They're preparing for a final push. We've done what we could, but we need to hit them hard. Now. Elliot's eyes flicked to the control panel, where the alien ships loomed ominously on the radar. They were massive, their black, jagged forms dominating the space around them, a stark contrast to the fragile human station they were determined to destroy. But something had shifted in the air. The humans were no longer the prey. They had become the hunters. Elliot quickly brought up the station's weapon systems. The turrets were online, but they were only capable of small-scale attacks. The station wasn't equipped for an all-out war. He needed to think bigger. He needed to find a way to turn the tide. His mind raced through all the calculations, all the systems he had worked on over the years. There was one thing left, one last option: a direct assault from the station's power grid, a concentrated burst of energy so massive it could knock out the shields of the enemy ships, rendering them vulnerable. But it was a dangerous plan. Using the station's energy reserves like that would push the system to its limits. If it failed, the station would be obliterated. There was no middle ground. "Commander," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "I have a plan, but I'll need your team to help me. We're going to overload the power grid, create a concentrated energy pulse strong enough to disable their shields. It's our only shot." Commander Davies was silent for a moment. Elliot could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. Finally, the commander spoke. "Do it. We're not going down without a fight." Elliot wasted no time. He ran through the corridors of the station, his boots pounding on the metal floors. The station was beginning to shake again, more violently this time. The alien ships had resumed their attack, their weapons hammering against the shields with renewed intensity. Elliot's heart raced. He had to work quickly. The power grid was housed in the lower levels, a sprawling network of cables and systems that stretched deep beneath the station. It was a maze of metal and wires, and Elliot had spent countless hours down here when he first arrived, learning how to keep the systems running smoothly. But now, the pressure was different. He wasn't just fixing something that was broken. He was about to gamble everything on the hope that his knowledge of the grid would be enough to save them all. The access doors to the power grid slid open, and Elliot stepped into the dimly lit chamber. The air was thick with the smell of old machinery, the hum of the system vibrating through the floor beneath him. Elliot quickly went to work, his fingers moving with practiced precision. He connected wires, rerouted power, and reprogrammed systems as fast as his mind could calculate. He knew the risks. The energy pulse, if miscalculated, could tear the station apart, but the alternative, waiting for the aliens to breach the shields and destroy them, was no option at all. He had to succeed. There was no other way. The countdown to the enemy's next attack was ticking in the back of his mind. Elliot worked through the sweat pouring down his face, his breath coming in short bursts. He glanced at the readouts. The power systems were overloading, just as he had planned. One final push, and the energy pulse would be ready. With a deep breath, he pressed the final sequence of buttons. The entire station seemed to hold its breath as the power core hummed louder, building to a crescendo. It was as though the station itself was alive, and its very survival depended on this moment. "Elliot, we're ready to fire," came the voice of Commander Davies. Elliot's heart raced as he stared at the system's status. The energy pulse was primed, ready to launch. "Do it," Elliot said, voice tight with tension. In that moment, the space outside the station seemed to hold its breath as well. The alien ships continued their assault, unaware of the trap that had been set for them. The pulse fired. A blinding flash of light erupted from the station's core, shooting toward the enemy fleet like a spear of pure energy. The shockwave rippled through space, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The pulse hit the lead alien ship first, its shields flaring and then crumbling under the intense burst. The ship's hull buckled under the force, and it exploded in a burst of fire and debris. The second ship was next. Its shields faltered, and the pulse slammed into it, creating a massive explosion that sent shockwaves through the surrounding fleet. The rest of the enemy ships hesitated, disoriented by the sudden, overwhelming attack. They had not expected this. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. But as the pulse continued to rip through the enemy ships, Elliot could hear a soft, nagging doubt in the back of his mind. This wasn't over. The alien fleet might be faltering, but they were still dangerous. And even though the humans had delivered a devastating blow, they had only bought themselves a moment of respite. The station shook again, this time with less intensity. The pulse had done its job, but at a great cost. The station's power grid was critically unstable, and the hum of the machinery now carried a threatening undertone. Elliot knew that they didn't have much time before the energy reserves completely depleted. "Elliot, what now?" Commander Davies asked, his voice strained. "We need to prepare for another wave." Elliot looked out the viewport, his eyes narrowing. The alien fleet was retreating, for now, but they would be back. They would regroup and come at them harder next time. But this time, the humans had shown them something. They had shown them that humanity could strike back. "We prepare for the next wave," Elliot said, determination filling his voice. "But this time, we're ready." The war had only just begun, and Elliot knew that this battle would define humanity's place in the galaxy. No longer would they be seen as weak or vulnerable. No longer would they be easy prey. The galaxy would learn that the human spirit was as unbreakable as it was fierce. And Elliot Kane, the quiet engineer, would be at the heart of it all. The battle outside the station had subsided, but the war was far from over. The alien ships, their once dominant fleet now crippled, had pulled back into the darkness of space, licking their wounds, but they weren't defeated. Elliot knew they would return. They always returned. The station was in a state of chaotic recovery. The damage from the alien assault had been immense, but thanks to the pulse he had unleashed, the enemy had been forced into retreat. It was a temporary victory, and Elliot couldn't afford to rest on it. Every moment counted. Inside the command center, Elliot stood by the central console, watching the diagnostic systems run. His mind was still working at full speed, calculating the next steps. The humans had won this battle, but there were so many questions left unanswered. Why had the aliens attacked a human hospital ship? What was their ultimate goal? And how did they know so much about the station's systems? Commander Davies entered the room, his tired eyes betraying the strain of the last few hours. "Elliot," he said, voice heavy, "you did it. You bought us the time we needed. But now, what's next?" Elliot looked up, his eyes narrowing as he thought. "We need to learn from this. We need to understand the aliens' tactics. They're smarter than we thought. They adapted to our strategies too quickly." "Agreed," Davies said, walking over to the screen where the ship's logs were being analyzed. "I don't think they expected us to fight back like we did, but we can't underestimate them. They're a formidable force." Elliot nodded but didn't speak for a moment. The enemy's retreat was only a temporary break, but the pulse had been their turning point. The humans had struck a powerful blow, but there was something more. There was something behind the enemy's attack that wasn't just about power. It was about knowledge. Elliot felt an unsettling realization settle in his chest. The aliens weren't just attacking for conquest. They were gathering information. The attack on the hospital ship had been a test, a probe. They had learned about human capabilities, and the next wave would be even more devastating. "Commander, we're dealing with something far more dangerous than we thought," Elliot said, his voice quiet but urgent. "The aliens didn't come here to destroy us. They came to learn about us, to understand how we fight. They didn't just test our defenses, they were testing our response. And they know exactly where we're weak." Commander Davies paused, his eyes narrowing. "You think they've been watching us all along?" Elliot met his gaze. "Yes, they've been studying us. And now they know what we're capable of. They'll come back stronger next time, and they'll come prepared." The weight of Elliot's words hung in the air like a thick fog. The station's repair teams worked furiously in the background, trying to stabilize the energy grid and patch up the holes in the shields, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency in the room. They couldn't afford another attack like the one they had just survived. "Commander," Elliot said, his mind racing with the implications of what he was proposing, "I need to get back to the power grid. There's something I've been working on, a project that might give us an advantage in the next battle." "You're not suggesting another power surge, are you?" Commander Davies asked, his brow furrowing. "No," Elliot said quickly. "Not a power surge. Something more. Unconventional." Commander Davies raised an eyebrow. "Unconventional." Elliot explained his idea in quick, urgent bursts. He wanted to tap into the station's experimental technologies, specifically a set of old experimental sensors designed for deep space reconnaissance. The technology had never been fully tested, and it wasn't perfect, but it could be adapted to give them a crucial edge. The idea was to create an advanced early warning system, something that could detect the enemy fleet from much farther away, give them time to prepare before the aliens even arrived. And even better, if he could link it with the station's power grid, they could potentially even send a direct counterpulse to disrupt the enemy's weapon systems from the very moment they appeared. It was risky. The technology was untested, and it might not work, but it was the only option Elliot could think of to give them a fighting chance. Commander Davies listened carefully, nodding as Elliot spoke. When he finished, the commander didn't hesitate. "Do it," he said simply. "We need every edge we can get. You've got 24 hours to make it work. If this fails, we'll have to rely on our backup systems." "Understood," Elliot replied, already turning to leave the room. As he made his way through the station, his mind kept racing, thinking about what the future held. The enemy wasn't just a mindless force. They were calculating, intelligent, and they had a plan. And if Elliot and the humans were going to survive this war, they would have to be smarter, more adaptable than they had ever been before. He reached the lower levels of the station, the hum of machinery growing louder as he descended deeper into the belly of the ship. The power grid was still unstable, and the crackling sound of damaged circuits filled the air. But Elliot was focused. He had a job to do, and nothing was going to stop him. With his tools in hand, he began working quickly, rerouting power, adjusting circuits, and recalibrating the sensors. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he worked, the pressure mounting. Every click of a switch, every line of code he typed into the system, brought them one step closer to the next phase of the battle. He knew that time was against them, and every moment spent working was a moment the aliens might use to strike. His heart raced as he initiated the final sequence. The sensors powered up, and the early warning system began to hum to life. A quiet ping sounded on the screen, indicating a successful connection. The system was active. Elliot let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This was it. They had a fighting chance now. The galaxy might not know it yet, but humanity was about to show the universe that they were more than just a speck in the stars. As he looked out into the dark abyss of space, Elliot couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning. The humans might have survived this wave, but the real challenge was yet to come, and they had to be ready for it. The aliens would be back, and this time, they wouldn't be underestimating the human mind. The quiet hum of the station was the only sound that filled the room as Elliot stared out at the stars. His eyes were fixed on the empty expanse of space, but his thoughts were far from calm. The work was far from over. They had developed a new weapon, a system that could give them a real chance in the next wave of attack. But in his gut, Elliot knew that nothing would guarantee their survival. The enemies were powerful, and the war had only just begun. Elliot, we're good to go. Commander Davies' voice interrupted his thoughts. The deep, gravely tone of the commander's voice carried an undertone of urgency, as though time was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Elliot turned slowly and nodded, pulling himself from the quiet abyss of his mind. He had completed the system, linked the sensors with the station's power grid, and tweaked the weapon's feedback loop to ensure they could knock out the alien ship's communication systems, rendering them momentarily vulnerable. But now, they had to wait. It was a waiting game. The galaxy didn't work on human time. Out there, in the infinite reaches of space, the enemy could be readying for their next assault at any moment. "What's the status?" Elliot asked, walking over to the control panel, where Commander Davies was already standing, peering at the latest tactical data. "Repaired what we could. Shields are holding for now, but I don't need to tell you that we can't take another direct hit like the last one. We've stabilized the energy grid, but it's not going to last forever." Davies' eyes narrowed as he scanned the readouts. "The real question is, are we prepared?" "Prepared. We've had one shot at this," Elliot said, his voice tight with stress. "We've barely had time to breathe, and you want to know if we're prepared." "Of course, we're not prepared. But we're not giving up, Commander. We're going to hit back harder." Commander Davies nodded. He didn't have to say anything more. Elliot knew the weight on the commander's shoulders. The crew was on edge, and though they had successfully warded off the first wave, the enemy's ability to adapt was alarming. This was no longer about survival. It was about asserting humanity's place in the galaxy. The last few hours had felt like a blur. The makeshift weapon system Elliot had created, fusing the station's experimental reconnaissance tech with the energy grid, was their best shot at holding off the aliens, but the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just the lives of the station's crew at risk anymore. It was the future of humanity. If the aliens broke through, they would send a clear message to the rest of the galaxy. Humans were weak, vulnerable, and easy prey. "We're not just defending the station anymore. We're defending everything we are," Elliot said, as if speaking to himself. "Exactly," Commander Davies agreed. "It's not just about saving the crew. It's about proving that humanity is a force to be reckoned with. We've survived this long for a reason." Elliot didn't answer right away. The weight of their mission pressed down on him. Humanity wasn't just in a fight for survival anymore. It was in a fight for respect, for a place in the universe that had always seemed far beyond their reach. As he turned back to the console, his fingers moved over the controls with purpose. The sensors were active now. The communication system was ready. The first alien ships had yet to reappear, but the countdown had already begun. They had a limited window to take action before the aliens regrouped. Suddenly, a soft ping echoed from the sensor panel, followed by another. The system was picking up movement, distant, faint, but unmistakable. The enemy fleet was on the move again. "They're back," Elliot said, his voice low. "Let's hope we're ready," Commander Davies responded, his face grim. "We'll make our stand here." Elliot didn't need to be told twice. They had no more time to waste. His hands were steady as he activated the final sequence to link the power grid to the sensors. The energy buildup was beginning to hum, a low, vibrating sound that sent a shiver through his spine. This was it, the last chance. A sharp alarm sounded as the alien ships entered the system, their dark shapes appearing on the radar like a storm cloud on the horizon. They were smaller than before, but the danger was no less real. The ships began to position themselves for an attack, and the station's shields were already straining under the pressure of the incoming fire. "Prepare to fire on my mark," Elliot ordered, his eyes glued to the screens. Commander Davies gave a sharp nod. Ready. The enemy fleet had no idea what was coming. The sensors were up, the power grid was locked in, and the station was primed for the strike. Elliot's hands hovered over the control panel, his heart racing, every muscle tense. They had one shot. The first wave of enemy ships moved into position, opening fire. The station's shields were immediately hit, flickering under the assault. The enemy fleet had underestimated them again. The moment they opened fire, Elliot triggered the pulse. The flash was blinding. Light streaked through the station like a pulse of pure energy. It hit the enemy ships, and for a moment, nothing happened. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then, one by one, the alien ships began to falter, their weapons faltering, shields flickering as the feedback loop took hold. "We've got them," Elliot said with a grin, but it was short-lived. The alien ships weren't gone. They were staggering, but they weren't done yet. The first pulse had worked, but now the enemy was adjusting. They were learning, just like before. "Keep the pressure up," Davy shouted, his eyes wild with adrenaline. "They're not finished." Elliot quickly recalibrated the system. The next pulse was ready. He fired again, this time stronger, more refined. The enemy shields crumbled, and the lead ship erupted in a burst of flames, a massive explosion that sent debris flying in all directions. The rest of the fleet seemed to hesitate, clearly thrown off balance by the unexpected counterattack. But Elliot knew better than to celebrate too soon. This fight was far from over. The alien fleet had taken a hit, but it was not defeated. The humans had made their mark, but the true test of strength would come when the enemy regrouped. And they would. The war was only beginning, and humanity had shown that it would never back down. "We've done it," Commander Davies said, his voice thick with emotion. "For now, we've done it." Elliot's gaze drifted back to the stars. They had survived. For now. But the real fight was just beginning. And the human spirit, no matter how many times it was tested, was far from broken. The galaxy would know them now. Humanity was no longer just a species on the edge of the unknown. It was a force to be reckoned with. And they had just begun to prove it.